Okay, so just say thank you to Rob for inviting me to talk this evening. Um, what I want to do today is take a fairly broad brush exploration of the archaeology of early Christianity in the late Roman period into the early medieval period, along what we might broadly call the Roman frontier of northern Britain. So I'm going to be talking about sites which are broadly kind of north of the Humber line, and perhaps extending up into the Fourth Clyde line. And chronologically, I'm going to be thinking about mainly focusing on the 4th century into the 5th and early 6th century. And I think this is quite important because often when we look at the transition from the late Roman period into the early medieval period, often a lot of the debates and discussions are about rupture and change, though obviously increasingly people like Rob, amongst others, are arguing for a more nuanced approach. And it's actually when we look at the things like the evidence of the early church in our period, this is one of the social institutions where we do actually see clear evidence of continuity from the late Roman into the early medieval period. So first things first, when we are at school or when we're reading old-fashioned history books, we're often given the idea that Christianity arrives in England in AD 597 with Saint Augustine, who is sent to convert the Anglo-Saxons. But of course, that's an incredibly kind of Anglo-Saxon-centric approach. It doesn't take much research and reading to realize that there has been Christianity in Britain for much longer, and Christianity was certainly present in Britain in the late Roman period. Obviously, Christianity itself emerges as a religion in the kind of very early 1st century AD in an East Mediterranean context, and obviously that is within the Roman Empire. So it's not surprising that one would find Christianity spreading across the empire relatively early. Now, do we have evidence for Christianity in Britain before the 4th century, before the Emperor Constantine? It's really difficult to say. One of the problems we're going to talk about in a second is how do you recognize early Christianity? It's not a very easy thing to do, surprisingly. We have the occasional passing references in early church writers. So, for example, Tertullian writes how the haunts of the Britons are inaccessible to the Romans but subjugated to Christ. And we see other early church writers hinting at the presence of Christianity in Roman Britain before Constantine. However, one of the troubles is a lot of these early church fathers are writing in a very rhetorical way, and in Roman writing, Britain has the same kind of role that perhaps, say, Timbuktu might have amongst kind of more recent writers. Britain is seen as somewhere which is remote and difficult and unusual. So it's very hard to know whether when people like Tertullian mention Christianity in Britain, whether they actually just mean Christianity is incredibly widely spread. It might simply be that they're using Britain as a kind of rhetorical figure or rhetorical trope to describe the wide early spread of the church. We do have hints of early martyrs in Britain. Obviously, there's periods of persecution in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. Perhaps the most celebrated martyr is Saint Alban, who is probably, but actually not certainly, probably martyred at St. Albans. We also have reference to martyrs called Julian and Aaron, who are probably martyred in Caerleon. The trouble with these early figures is we're only really seeing them, we only really have records of them through early medieval, later textual sources. So a lot of what we know about these early martyrs is filtered through several centuries of later kind of thought and historical writing. So we know very little about the reality of what they experienced. There's also been attempts to try and identify evidence for early Christianity through the archaeology. On the left, I've got this fragment of a word square. Word squares are little kind of alphabet games, little word puzzles, which some people have argued have an early Christian significance. So what we've got here is a fragment of a larger word square which says "Rotas opera tenet arepo sator," which basically is it's a little nonsense line about a ploughman. And the idea is that if you see the square, you can see, if you look at the word tenet, it kind of creates a cross in the middle. Also, there's scope for making kind of anagrams out of the phrase paternoster. But a lot of these things, like the cross and the paternoster, these are ideas which actually weren't particularly or weren't prevalent at all in the church of this period. And generally, it's accepted now that things like these word squares were actually just little kind of games, little word games, and didn't have any particular religious significance. Really, as far as we're concerned, the evidence for Christianity in Britain kicks off in the 4th century. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the Emperor Constantine was raised to the purple. He became the emperor whilst in York, when his father Constantius died in York. And Constantine is the key figure, because it's Constantine who really puts the Christian church onto a substantively supported and legal footing. There have been periods during the Roman period before Constantine where Christianity had been effectively sanctioned, it was allowed to exist. But with the Edict of Milan in AD 313, Constantine, for the first time, really puts the imperial weight behind Christianity becoming a legal religion. It's important to note the Edict of Milan does not mean that Christianity became the only religion in the Roman Empire, or the state religion, or anything like that. That doesn't happen until later in the 4th century. What we do know, though, is that for the first time Constantine makes, or well, not for the first time, but for the first time we have real imperial support for the church, and crucially Constantine converts to Christianity himself on his deathbed. Now, this, although we tend to kind of talk about the Edict of Milan as being a really important moment, actually the slightly earlier Edict of Serdica, which was associated with the Eastern Roman Empire, had actually done the same kind of things as the Edict of Milan for the Eastern Roman Empire. So really we're seeing some real changes going on here. And I think the crucial thing is it's the element of imperial support for Christianity. Christianity suddenly goes from being a minority and a religion, and one which has little kind of institutional heft, to one which has the ideological and financial support of the Roman elite. Now, very soon after the Edict of Milan, we have an important church council, the Council of Arles, in AD 314, which is one of the first big church councils, bringing all together all the bishops from across the empire, the first one to take place after the Edict of Milan. And handily, we have some of the proceedings survive, some of the paperwork, as it were, from this meeting survives. And handily, it gives us information about the presence of bishops in Roman Britain a year after the Edict of Milan. So the Edict of Milan, the Council of Arles recalls that we have a figure called Eborius, the Bishop of the Civitatis of Eboracanthe, so that's the Bishop of York. We have a Restitutus, who is Bishop of London. We have an Adelphius, who is the records recall him as being the Bishop of Colonia Londiensium. And it looks like someone's confused London and possibly Lincoln. So there might be a bishop, he might be referring to Lincoln. And finally, we have another individual, a Sacerdos, a priest, and Arminius, a deacon. Now, when we look at the distribution of the bishops, we certainly thus have a bishop in York, bishop in London, probably a bishop in Lincoln. And this organisation probably reflects the fact that the diocese, or what's the late Roman diocese, and I'm using the word diocese in the secular sense, of Britannia, which is divided into 4 provinces. It looks like there might have been a bishop for the northern province, up where we are in the northern frontier, basically one for each of the subsidiary provinces of Britannia. And perhaps Sacerdos and Arminius might have been the bishops of the province centred on, not the bishops, but an ecclesiastical party centred on Corinium or Cirencester. So it kind of suggests that we have, a year after the Edict of Milan, a structure, an administrative structure for the church. Whether this is a a previously submerged structure suddenly emerging into the light of day, or whether this is newly laid out. We just simply don't know. But crucially, when it comes to the north, we have a bishop in York, and obviously York is the major urban centre for the northern frontier zone, even though it's set kind of well back from the wall itself. Now, there are other hints of other bishops. As well as the bishops from those known sites recorded in the Council of Arles, archaeology does just hint there might have been others. For example, on the left, we've got a lead, this is a lead salt pan from Shavington in Cheshire. And the inscription seems to say Viventi, that's the name Viventius, which we know is quite a common Christian name, and the back end of the word copi. And of course, inevitably, the key bit, the front of that word, is missing from the object. But the most convincing reconstructions are that this means Viventius Episcopi. And it could be the word episcopi meaning just an overseer, but in the 4th century, it's more commonly used to refer to a bishop. So we may have a this is from near Chester, so it may be that we've got a reference to a bishop within Chester, and obviously Chester as a major Roman town would be precisely the kind of place one would expect to find a bishop. Also, if other things like this on the right, we've got the Risley Park Lancs. So this is actually probably a modern copy of it, what we see here. This was a rather very impressive silver rectangular dish found in Derbyshire in the 18th century. Now you look at it on the front, and it's classic. It's full of scenes of classical religion. There's secular scenes of hunting. You can see the man trying to impale a boar in the middle. It looks very, very classical. But interestingly, on the back, there was an inscription which seems to have read Exuperius Episcopus Ecclesiae Bagiensi Dedit. Bishop Exuperius gives this to the Church of the Bagiensi. Now, it has been suggested that this object was actually imported from France, perhaps in the medieval or post-medieval period, and it perhaps refers to the bishop at Bayeux or the French town of Bourges. But it seems, I think the more economical explanation is that this is a genuinely Romano-British object. It looks very similar to other lancs from Britain, and again, so it does seem to hint that there's a bishop at a church of somewhere called Bagiensi, and we don't have records of where Bagiensi is, but perhaps it's not surprising that we do have quite a lot of sites in Roman Britain where we can't locate them precisely on the map. So these both can hint at the presence of bishops, and as Risley Park is Derbyshire and Cheshire is also kind of northish, North Midlands, the south of the north. Not sure how you want to describe it. Again, these both hint that perhaps that other bishops, other episcopal centres in late Roman Britain, in what you might call broadly the northern world. Also, we need to remember that there are certainly other figures within Roman Britain who were very important and certainly Christian. For example, we know that the Christian writer Ausonius in the 4th century is corresponding with Flavius Sanctus, who's a provincial governor in Britannia, who seems to be Christian on the basis of his correspondence with Ausonius. We also have references to a guy called Creanthus, who is vicar of the Diocese of Britannia, so a very senior civil administrator, but also he is both the son of a bishop of Constantinople, and he himself goes on to become a bishop of Constantinople. So as well as a network of bishops, we seem to have the key secular rulers in this period, administrators. Certainly where we have information about their religion, they seem to also have a close connection with the church. It's important, though, before we move onwards, to think about the practical challenges we have in trying to recognise the archaeology of the church in Britain, or indeed elsewhere in the 4th century. First of all, the church at this period is a work in progress. It has been repressed, working kind of under the radar, brief periods of being free, but generally speaking, having to be quite quiet, which means that in practical terms, it's quite poor. It hasn't had the money to build elaborate churches, so it means there's no clear set of church plans in this period. They've not been able to, on the whole, invest in elaborate art, exotic high status objects, which means the set of repertoire of iconography and symbols used by the church is still kind of coming together at this period. So, for example, key things we associate with the church today, like the cross, is not really used as a Christian symbol in this period. Significantly, the Edict of Milan and the associated imperial support suddenly changes all this. The church now has protection from the Roman elite. One of the key things that happens, it's allowed to hold land, so it starts acquiring significant wealth, which, particularly going along with the political patronage, means that the church suddenly goes from a kind of a poorer sibling to suddenly becoming one of the most powerful religious institutions within the empire, and suddenly in the 4th century is able to invest in objects and in buildings. But just generally, we just need to remember that the parameters, the edges of Christianity is still being kind of worked out. For example, the final form of the Bible it's not in place until the end of the 4th century. The agreed set of books which constitute the Bible only really kind of crystallize at the end of the fourth century. So a lot of the things we kind of think are inherent within Christianity are not necessarily in place in the 4th century. So we've got other challenges as well. And one of the other challenges is just generally in the 4th century, things are quite tricky when it comes to trying to understand religion, certainly in Roman Britain. One of the big changes is the decline of epigraphy, so the decline in the use of inscriptions, not just burial inscriptions or Christian inscriptions, the decline of all inscriptions in the Roman Empire. What I'm showing you here is what's called the Morozek curve, which is a kind of graphical representation of the intensity of inscription erection or putting them up, inscriptions talking everything, altars, dedication inscriptions, but particularly funerary inscriptions in the Roman Empire. And you can see it kind of achieves a peak at the end of the 2nd century, and then drops off massively over the 3rd century to very, very low levels by the beginning of the 4th century. So we have this problem that as we enter the 4th century, we're entering a period where we have very, very few inscriptions of any kind. So we can maybe be able to point and say, look, there's very few Christian inscriptions in the 4th century, but that's true of virtually all religious inscriptions of any type anyway. So we're kind of coming in to try and understand the Roman Christianity at a time when the presence of inscriptions are just very, very rare. And we see a similar kind of decline in the level of sculpture, the level of monumental buildings. The 4th century is a very difficult archaeology for a variety of reasons. We also have the problems that often it's very, very hard to distinguish between something which is clearly pagan or clearly Christian. So, for example, when we're looking at inscriptions, on the left we've got a gravestone from High Risingham, probably 2nd century, and it says Diem Aemilianus Honorum. And you've got the number 10. And that DM, dis manibus, it's a word, it means to the souls, to the dead. It's an inscription which you find on lots of clearly pagan Roman burial markers, very, very common. But DM can equally be used on Christian inscriptions. So a reference to the souls of the dead in a pagan context is equally being used on early Christian burial markers. So, for example, on the right is an early Christian burial marker from the early 3rd century from Rome, and it's clearly Christian. We've got the anchors and the fishes. There's absolutely clear Christian symbols, references to the fish in Greek, but a Latin inscription. And again, we've got DM at the top. So, as I said, often the kind of parameters, the boundaries of what is Christian and what is not Christian in this period are often very, very blurry. Bearing in mind, though, that all these problems with identifying inscriptions, and more generally, just the challenge of how do you date a simple inscription, when we look at the evidence for burial markers of all types in Roman Britain, when we look at their distribution for 4th century burial markers, we can see we've got they dominate distribution dominates the north. So we've got Templeborough down in West Yorkshire, some 4th century burial markers in York, then Catterick, and then a series in the northwest, Carlisle, Old Penrith, and a series of late burial markers at Broome. Now the question is, are these late burial markers, are they Christian? And we need to take on all the caveats we've already mentioned. Well, there's a huge amount of work has been done on these late Roman, or what might call late antique burial markers. A lot of work has been done trying to look at particular phrases or formula on burial markers to try and draw out those which might seem to be particularly related to Christianity, and bearing in mind that we've got examples from Britain, then quite a few from the continent as well. One possible indicator of a Christian identity to on a burial marker is this phrase titulum posuit. So it means to set up this inscription, to set up this monument. And a good example is the one we see on the left here from York: to the spirits of the departed, and to Mantinia America, and to her mother Candida Barata, Marcus Aurelius Simnus, set up this inscription. So titulum posuit. If we look at the distribution of those in Britain, again, we see they are all in the north. They are all associated with the military frontier zone. So a good proportion of our 4th century burial markers from the north all seem to have this titulum posuit phrase on it, which implies Christianity. There are other phrases which can be used in the same way to argue for a Christian identity. Here we see a burial marker to Flavius Antigonus Papias, a Greek man from he's buried in old Carlisle, and on the 4th row down, you can see this phrase plus minus. So he lived 60 years, more or less, plus minus, more or less. And that phrase plus me, that formula plus minus, is again only found in Britain, really, in the north, Carlisle and Broome and a couple of other sites. And again, this all seems to kind of consolidate the idea that in the north of Britain we have these late Roman burial inscriptions which are associated with phrases which are particularly associated with early Christianity. We do have other things which are perhaps more obviously Christian. This is a frustratingly now lost piece of sculpture from Maryport, which has a Chi Rho symbol on. So the Chi Rho is this P and the X you can see in front of us overlaid over each other. And of course, they're not really a P and an X. These are the Greek letters Chi and Rho, the first 2 letters of the word Christ. And this is perhaps rather than the cross, it's the Chi Rho, which is the dominant symbol or image of Christianity in the 4th and early 5th century. This piece, as I said, is frustratingly absent. It's got lost. We don't even really know how big it is. But it's perhaps not surprising to see evidence of masonry with a Chi Rho symbol on from the northern frontier. We do have other possible examples. On the left, we've got a fragment of stone from Catterick built into an early 4th century bathhouse, which seemingly seems to contain a Chi Rho image. And then perhaps more ambiguously is on the right from York, a possible Chi Rho of a slightly debased version carved onto etched and inscribed onto a ceramic tile from the Principia at York. Now, with all these things, with a very simple image like Chi Rho, particularly when they've been crudely done, it's not always easy to be certain that what we see is definitely a Chi Rho, rather than simply just a rough kind of cross or a star or an asterisk image. We also have other problems with the Chi Rho, that the Chi Rho essentially becomes for want of a better word, the logo, the emblem of the House of Constantine, and more generally the late Roman emperors. It becomes an image which is particularly associated with imperial power, imperial sanction. For example, I've already shown you a picture of a coin from Constantine with a Chi-Rho symbol on. On the left, you see a nummus from Magnentius, minted in Amiens in northern France, again with the Chi-Rho symbol on the reverse, and associated with the alpha and omega either side. So here we see, is this coin being specifically Christian, or is it simply using the Chi-Rho as an indicator of loyalty or fealty to the house of Constantine or the imperial house more generally? It's difficult to say. Another example is on this of this kind of thing is on this lovely, actually a find from Ireland. It's a silver ingot of clearly imported Roman silver found in County Limerick, seemingly of a broadly 5th century date, and it has this stamp on it. So it's a silver ingot which has been molten down and stamped with a kind of quality mark, a kite mark as it were, in presumably in Roman Britain, but could have been somewhere else in the Roman Empire. And we can see this phrase ex offic, so ex officinium from the workshop. It's a Roman vilis, so it's a shortening of a Roman name, and then in the middle you've got a little Chi-Rho symbol there. So again, is this a mark of Christianity? Why would a silver ingot be explicitly Christian? Or is it or is it an indicator that the stamping of this piece of silver was done under imperial jurisdiction? So you can see we need to be a little bit careful, perhaps, in automatically ascribing explicit Christianity whenever we see a Chi-Rho symbol in this context. It's worth perhaps thinking about the range of objects in which we have some kind of Christian identity on them in the 4th century. Now, I have to include this on the left. This is a ring from our excavations at the Roman fort at Binchester. This is a simple ring, a silver ring with probably a carnelian intaglio. And what you can see on it, we've already seen this symbol earlier on with that grave marker from Rome. We've got a pair of fish and an anchor. The fish are kind of doing handstands on the anchor, and we see that symbol in the Christian catacombs at Rome, and that's a image, a symbol which is clearly associated with early Christianity in this period. Now, rather pleasingly, there's another ring almost identical with the same image on it from another site in the north, Wellington Row in York. Again, a late Roman context. We have at least one other ring, a certain ring, a certain Chi-Rho symbol on it from Brough under Stainmore. And on this, through the Portable Antiquity scheme, perhaps again a little bit more ambiguously, a poorly surviving ring of the Brancaster types, a well-known late Roman ring type, perhaps with a Chi-Rho symbol on, although this is one of those cases where it might be a Chi-Rho or it might simply be a kind of simple asterisk. It's worth saying, though, that when we look at the wider corpus of Christian material from the south and the east of Roman Britain, we do have multiple other examples of rings carrying clear Christian imagery. Now, in the case of the use of the Chi-Rho on a ring, again we come back to this problem: is it a mark of Christian identity, or is it a mark of affiliation or loyalty to the late Roman Empire? We have other interesting objects which seem to have some kind of Christian identity from the north. On the left is a lovely little kind of strap end, or well, it's been called a strap end. I think it's probably more likely to be one of these so-called nail cleaner strap ends from Vindolanda, and we're going to come back to Vindolanda several times over the next kind of forthcoming kind of 40 minutes. And what you see on this is this rather groovy little figure of this tiny little person with decorated with little rings, lovely little face, and arguably with at least one hand held up. And it's not quite clear whether they're holding a kind of long, curvy object staff above them, or whether that staff is meant to be a kind of just a cartouche within which the figure fits. Now, this kind of figure with holding the hands up, that is what's called the orans pose, and that is essentially the default position in which people prayed in this period. Nowadays, we tend to think of prayer, the position of prayer, as being on one's knees with the hands together. We have lots and lots and lots of visual imagery from the late Roman and early medieval church, which shows very clearly the main position of prayer in this period was standing up with your hands out like that, kind of doing jazz hands almost. Now, the interesting thing about this little figure from Vindolanda is we don't have these strap ends, strap end nail cleaner things are relatively common finds in a late Roman context, but some of them just have pure abstract decoration, but others have a very interesting set of images on. So on the right, here are some parallels. So the top right, we can see a nail cleaner that from some Sandy in Bedfordshire, and it's got the Chi Rho symbol on. Now, it's very hard to imagine that would be a marker of imperial political alignment. It seems much more likely that is a marker of Christian affiliation. And interestingly, when we look at some of the other ones, we have peacocks. We know peacocks are a clear indicator, a clear symbol of Christianity in this period. So we have peacocks on some of them. Whoops. We have fish, and again, a fish can be a Christian symbol. We've got a peacock and a griffin and a kind of chalice in the middle. Now, interestingly, when we look at the broader assemblage of these kind of strap ends, the only kind of religious imagery you find on these is Christian. This is not a case of lots of other kinds of religious imageries also appearing on these. This group of objects, the only kind of religious imagery you have on them is Christian, and I think that's quite significant. But what other kind of objects do we find? And obviously, with this talk, I had to come on to this. This is the so-called Vindolanda chalice, which was found about 18 months ago at Vindolanda in very late layers during excavations, associated with an apsidal structure. I'll talk more about the apsidal structures in Vindolanda a little bit later. And this is something I'm currently working on. And this is one of those really frustrating objects, which is both incredibly important and absolutely unparalleled, which means it's literally it's very, very hard to find comparisons, parallels, objects which are broadly like it. So it's very hard to understand what's going on. The first thing to say, it's a squashed lead vessel, or pewter vessel, perhaps, of some variety. It's not very big. I'll show you a photograph of it in a second. But it's covered in these variety of little, and these are very small little images. And some of them do seem to be kind of variations on the Chi Rho image. So this one here, you can see with my cursor, hopefully, there's possible kind of Chi Rho type images here. We have other images. We have fish. We've already seen fish in a Christian context. We have little figures. This little guy here, perhaps holding across, little faces. But we have boats. We have all sorts of other intriguing images, so-called butterflies. And one of the things I'm trying to do at the moment is to trying to unpick this at the moment. As I said, it's very hard to find anything which has so many individual images scrawled onto it. And it's important to note they are on both sides. They're on the interior and the exterior of the object. It's not actually that hard to find individual objects of Christian affiliation with maybe one or two of those kind of simple, very, very sketchy symbols placed on them, particularly on the bottom of vessels, where they seem to perhaps almost be an owner's mark. But it's much, much harder to find something which has that density of objects on. The only kind of parallels I've found to that kind of density of imagery is some bowls found from kind of broadly the Eastern Roman Empire, where they have a variety of different images on, and they seem to be related to kind of prognostication or fortune telling, though these are often much more kind of rigidly laid out. There's much more order to what you see. It's also worth talking a little bit about the object itself. So it's called a chalice, and I think we're pushing our luck to say that it definitely is a chalice, because obviously within the Christian liturgy, the chalice has a very specific function. It's the vessel within which the wine is held during the Eucharist, over which the Eucharistic prayers are said, and that is one of the key points of the heart of the mystery of the Christian liturgy, that the blood is transformed into the blood, the wine is transformed into the blood of Christ. Now, we have some parallels, one or two possible parallel chalices from the late Roman world, and unfortunately they don't look anything like what we've got here. But I don't think that makes this any less interesting. I'm actually fascinated by what we've got here is a lead object, and you might think a lead cup is something which, or a pewter object is something which implies it's cheap and cheerful. What's interesting, though, is in late Roman Britain, there is a very distinct and widespread tradition of depositing pewter vessels, dishes, cups, jugs, flagons, in groups in what we might broadly call ritual context. I know everyone always accuses archaeologists of calling anything they can't explain a ritual object, but in these are often found in association with unusual associated other unusual material, often carefully placed in wells in a fairly structured and orderly way, and a significant minority of these pewter tankards, pewter vessels, do have Cairo images on them. So what we seem to have here is perhaps the most northerly and most idiosyncratic, most unusual example. You can see on the map here that the vast majority of this kind of votive deposition of pewter objects is mainly the East Midlands and the South more generally, far fewer in the North. Now, interestingly, also we have there's a small what's described as a tin cup from Carabruff in a kind of in a ritual context as well, and it's a very similar kind of location to what the Vindolanda object is. So what I'm exploring at the moment is that this object is somehow related to this late Roman and distinctively Romano-British tradition of creating ritual vessels with the Christian importance using pewter. And what's interesting is a lot of this pewter has a very, very high lead content, to the extent that it probably would never have actually functioned as dishes or plates. As soon as you cut anything, as soon as you scraped it, you left marks on it. And it has been suggested that some of this lead material is created purely to be deposited, purely to be an offering. So at the moment, this is what I'm exploring, thinking about this Vindolanda vessel as a unusual, probably Christian deposit. The fact that we've got, what makes it unique is the sheer density of the imagery, and while some of the images do have good parallels with other Christian items, a lot of that imagery is more or less unique, which presents quite obvious interpretational challenges. We can't make parallels to something if there are no parallels. But thinking about the role of vessels and containers in a Roman Christian context, again, perhaps in another inevitable photograph. This is a photograph of the Traprain Law hoard. Now, Traprain Law is a rocky volcanic plug, a great big hill fort up in East Lothian, up in Scotland. If anyone's ever driven up to Edinburgh on the A1, the twin hills of Traprain Law and North Berwick kind of dominate that northern part of the drive. Now, it's clearly an important site. It's a hill fort. There's all sorts of things going on there. But one of the most significant discoveries there was by Cecil Curl in early excavations here, and he stumbled across this simply epic silver hoard. And we can see this silver hoard contains all sorts of things. It contains lots of complete vessels. It also contains coins, it contains dress items, it contains spoons, you can see down on the left here, and it contains coins, but also while some of this material is intact, a lot of this material has also been broken up. Some of it, essentially a lot of this material is what's called hack silver. It's silver bullion broken down into kind of individual packets. And within this immense range of silver plate is material which has clear Christian imagery. So on the left here, we see a lovely silver gilded flagon. And as you can see here, there's a whole series of Christian images on it. And we've got Adam and Eve and the apple tree and the serpent there. So very, very nice Christian imagery. On the right, we've got a Chi-Rho symbol on a silver spoon. And in the center, we've got a strainer, probably for wine. And you can see punched into it is the Chi-Rho image. Now, this is just this. I'll show you some other Christian imagery from Traprain law in a second. Now, the date of this silver hoard is early 5th century. You can be fairly confident it fits into kind of early 5th century date. But obviously, we're well north of Hadrian's Wall. So why is there this massive silver hoard well north of Hadrian's Wall? Well, first thing to say is Roman Britain, more generally, has some of the best late Roman silver treasures in the Roman Empire. Things like the Mildenhall treasure, the Hoxton treasure, the Thetford treasure from East Anglia. There's a whole series of these great big exotic depositions of silverware. And a lot of them contain mixed kind of Christian imagery and imagery of classical mythology. So it's clear that a lot of it's marked with things like Chi-Rho symbols. So it's clear that certainly in the south of England and East Anglia, there seems to have been a wealthy Roman elite who were not just wealthy, they were seriously wealthy. The level of amount of silver plate in Roman Britain really rivals anything in the Roman Empire in this period. It's really quite remarkable. So we certainly have in the south of Britain, south of England, a wealthy Christian elite. Now, what is this stuff doing up in the north? Now, you have a whole lecture on this. The general feeling is that this material was two possible explanations. One is that this is material which has been removed forcibly from the Roman province by raiders who've coming down from the north of the wall down into the more Romanized parts of the country and have collected this material, and it's breaking it up into bullion to perhaps distribute to others. Alternatively, and the argument I find more persuasive, is what we've actually got here is a large, essentially diplomatic bribe to the Vostadini, who are the local tribespeople in this area, who are probably essentially a friendly client state of the Roman period, of the client kingdom of the Romans in the 4th century. And this is essentially a donative, a great gift to them. Now, the question, of course, is if it's a gift to the Vostadini, is this silver which has been collected in the north of England to go on and be sent over the wall, or does this represent an assemblage of material, perhaps from diverse sources from across Roman Britain? And that is the $1 million question, and perhaps one that's not easy to actually answer. It's worth saying, though, that we do have Christian silver plate from the north. On the right, you see an image of a bowl found in the river Corbridge. And again, this is a nice silver vessel. And if we just go back to the picture of Traprain law, you can see some of these round vessels here, a nice parallel to those beaded rims. So a nice parallel to that to the Corbridge example here. Now, this is found in the river or river bank, and there's a whole series of other silver objects which have been found around Bywell and Corbridge, and are generally seen as being probably representative of elements of a large silver hoard which may have been placed in the river deliberately. Now, interestingly, one of the elements of the big hoard is this thing on the left, the Corbridge lanx. We've already seen a lanx, one of these big silver rectangular vessels, or trays almost. And again, here you've got very classical imagery going on here. But interestingly, we find this kind of harks to the kind of silver vessel plates found in things like the Mildenhall hoard down from Suffolk, which has this very kind of classicizing imagery on it, but also we find similar stuff in the Mildenhall hoard. We also have Christian material. So I don't think it's necessarily that the Traprain law stuff has to come from the south. It could have been created or at least in use in the north. We find other bits of possible silver Christian material in the north, so this spoon from Sunderland, and then a range of other objects with Christian imagery. So Traprain Law Hoard, we've got this belt buckle with an alpha and omega on it. We've got a belt buckle from Stanek, again with our peacocks confronted. So again, there's more and more of these kind of objects which have Christian imagery on from the north. We're talking exotic stuff like the big silver plates. We've got unusual things like the Vindolanda object, and we've got mundane things like strap ends and the belt buckle on the right, and then the belt buckle on the left, which is silver and is perhaps indicative of higher status. So there's really quite a lot of evidence for the presence of Christianity on the northern frontier. A final example from the Roman period is this. This is the ivory bangle lady from York, so-called, found with ivory bangles. It's a late Roman burial from York, from near Bootham in York, and she has this ivory strip with a phrase. It's not brilliantly preserved, but it's best translated as "Hail, sister, may you live in God." This Vivas Deo seems to be a fairly convincing Christian phrase. Often in the literature, people say because she's buried with grave goods and aligned north-south, she can't be Christian, even though she has this in her grave. Though I think it's probably worth emphasising, we don't know really what burial traditions 4th century Christians were doing in Roman Britain. We can't assume they're all west-east and findless. So I think it's just as likely that the ivory bangle lady from York is the burial of a Christian. I don't think there's any reason a priori to assume that she isn't Christian. And interestingly, work done on her bone, on her skeleton, suggested she's probably of North African descent, but also clearly someone who is very wealthy. Again, perhaps reminding us of the economic wealth of at least some Christians in the Roman North. Churches are very difficult to talk about because in this period, in the 4th century, there's no real distinctive church plan. The earliest plans of churches on the whole, more generally on the Roman Empire, tend to be simple basilicas, so a rectangular structure with an apsidal end, a roundish end, and and aisles. The trouble is the basilica form is used for all sorts of things in the late Roman period and the early Roman period. It's used for pagan temples, it's used for things like Mithraeum, it's used for secular meeting places like Schola, it can be used for as administrative structures. So it's very, very hard to know. We don't have a distinctive footprint of a church. However, there are some possible examples. This is the possible example at Vindolanda, where we've got a rectangular structure of an apsidal lens in one of the main headquarters building projecting out into the courtyard. Now, we find something very similar kind of plan at St. Paul in the Bayle in Lincoln, which is one of the few cases, I think, where we can actually point to a definite Roman church. And we can only, and the St. Paul in the Bayle, we can only be certain that it was a church, or almost certain it was a church, because it carries on into the early medieval and then later medieval period as a church. So the way it kind of projects out into the central courtyard, I think is certainly circumstantial evidence, if not definitive evidence, that what we've got here at Vindolanda is a church. So we get to the 5th century, and lots changes in the 5th century. I'm sure you're all aware. As far as Christianity is concerned, one of the big changes is it erupts beyond the borders. By the end of the 5th century, Christianity seems to be well embedded certainly in southern Scotland, so that right west into far west of Galloway, up to the Firth of Forth. Also, crucially, it erupts over into Ireland, and then there's a secondary kind of exportation of Christianity from Northern Ireland into Western Scotland in the 6th century. So there's all sorts of reasons we can kind of try and dig into to explain it, but I mean, some of it may have been kind of borrowing, but we certainly have clear evidence of active missioning as well. So we see this most clearly in Ireland, where the Pope Celestine sends an individual called Palladius to Ireland. He's been kind of eclipsed by Patrick, but it's Palladius who's actually the original missionary sent to Ireland in the 430s in the mid 5th century. But of course, Patrick is a figure we associate more with the conversion of Ireland. Now, Patrick's really interesting because he's essentially a late Roman Briton. You know, he writes that he comes from Britain, and he describes his family. So he's a Christian, his father's a Christian, and his grandfather is a Christian. So we seem to have evidence again of an elite who are, maybe not a high elite, but a kind of local elite who are embedded within the Christian church. Now, can we say where Patrick comes from? Really frustrating. He said he comes from somewhere called Banavem Tabernii. It's great, he gives us a name. Unfortunately, we don't know where Banavem Tabernii is. It could be somewhere Burdoswald-y. One of the Roman names for Burdoswald is Banner, but it's difficult to say. A northern context, certainly a western context, is most probable because he's captured by Irish pirates, so he's most likely to be from the western side of the country. Interestingly, Patrick also writes a letter to an individual called Coroticus, asking him to stop slave raiding, and this Coroticus is probably associated with Strathclyde. So again, writing in the mid-5th century, he's writing to this king who presumably has people who can read Latin in his court, and this king in Strathclyde seems to be Christian. So again, evidence of this sudden spread of Christianity in the 5th century beyond the Hadrian's Wall. Now, we've got lots of gravestones. As we get into the 5th century, we see a rise again in inscriptions. There's about 230 kind of 5th and 6th century Latin grave markers or burial markers from north and west of Britain, so Cornwall, Wales, and the north. Here are some examples from elsewhere, not the north, and they're not brilliant quality, but you can see they're clearly part of that late Roman tradition, of burial marking and burial inscriptions, and they fit into a broader late antique tradition of slightly nicer ones, but ones created across the kind of Western Roman Empire, North Africa, Spain, Gaul, Germany, and similar things in Italy and into the Eastern Roman Empire. So better carving in these examples, but a similar range of inscriptions. So in hoc tumulo, in this grave, you see on the one on the right there, and where you go, hic tumulo on the ones from Cornwall and Wales. So these new burgeoning tradition of 5th century gravestones is clearly part of a much wider emerging flowering of Christian burial markers in the 5th and 6th century. Now here's an example from some of the northern ones. There's more than this, but there's see Chesterholm, so Vindolanda on the left, Capstane, this is from Kirkliston, Edinburgh Airport, Yarrow near Selkirk, Manor-Water near Peebles, and again, there you can see they fit into the same kind of broad pattern. Interestingly, though, if we look at the distribution of these ones, they're very different from the distribution of the 4th century ones we looked at earlier. Those 4th century ones are from the late Roman province of Britannia. They are from south of the wall. By the time we get into the 5th and 6th century, we see these new ones, but they're all, apart from Vindolanda, they're all north of the wall. Vindolanda's so damn near on the wall as to make no difference. So it's interesting. We see perhaps arguably a continuity of Christian, a tradition of making Christian gravestones, but rather than having them, but there's a kind of change in the sense that they're suddenly all found in the north, and actually in two fairly limited areas, a circumscribed evident area in Western Galloway, and then in the central borders, come Newcastleton, Yarrow, Peebles, Manor-Water, and this outlier up in the north. So similarities, but also big changes in the distribution. Now, a lot of them are quite crude, but we do have this interesting set from Kirkmadreen in west of Galloway, which are a bit more refined, and these are the only ones which have really nice cross markings on. We've got what's called a hook Cairo, so it's not a full Cairo, but it's a cross with that little row hook on it. Now, these are really interesting because the best parallels to these kind of decorations, that kind of imagery, is, as we have seen, from the broader continent. So there you've got a hook row cross there, you can see, and again on this central one. So this actually shows not just a continuity, but arguably people are actually from Galloway have actually seen these things on the continent and are deliberately, either people have come who've seen them masons or priests who from the continent know what they want when they come to Galloway, or people in Galloway are going down to the Roman Empire and seeing parallels for these. And this is what's interesting is Dumfries, these Galloway examples, Western Galloway examples, they're like some of the early crosses from places like Ireland as well. And they are, in that sense, they're a bit different from what's going on further east into Scotland. But there's actually quite nice parallels to these very simple kind of crosses from northern Gaul. And northern Gaul, in the same way Britain has a late antique Britain has a rich tradition in crappy Christian carving, Christian inscriptions. Northern Gaul has a rich tradition of really rather crappy, apologise for language, really rather poor cross carvings and burial markers in northern France more generally. So arguably we do have perhaps connections with Gaul at this period. Another interesting possible connection with Gaul is this weird little figure from over Kirkup up in the Scottish borders. Again, he's like a little Oran's figure. He's got his jazz hands there. This is from a side valley off a side valley in the Scottish borders. So what it's doing there is rather unusual, but we do have kind of parallels. The kind of slightly weird hair is a bit like our little figure on Vindolanda strap ends. The crazy jazz hands, the cross in the middle is very like some of the images you find of Oran's figures from Merovingian Gaul. So again, perhaps there's hints of Gaulish influence in this period, but this is a very tricky object to understand. We have more clearly Christian things. This is from Whithorn, and again starts that phrase "Te Dominum laudamus," we praise thee, Lord. And you can't get a more Roman looking, more late antique looking burial marker than that, even though it's found up in Whithorn, up in Dumfries and Galloway. It's well outside the Roman Empire. So what's interesting is in the 5th century we're seeing the spread of Christianity, and together the thing about Christianity is it brings literacy. The fact people can carve these things, write the inscriptions and read them, it implies literacy, and crucially Latin literacy as well. So these things, the spread of a church is really, really important here. Just for time, I'm going to skip through a couple of things very, very quickly. We can see these burial markers are found in unusual places. This is Yarrow, where the burial marker with a lovely Latin inscription seems to be part of a broader landscape of reused prehistoric standing stones. So you've got some interesting mixing up of Christian and prehistoric stuff. And also, in at least one case, we could be certain, this is from Capstane, Kirkliston near Edinburgh, that the burial marker was the centre of a large surrounding cemetery. So I'm going to just finish off very, very quickly now by thinking about monasteries. So just 2 slides on monasteries. Do we have monasteries in this period? We know by the time we get to the 6th, 7th century, monasticism is spreading in the early medieval world. But do we have them in the 5th century? It's difficult because monasticism in the Western Roman Empire is only just emerging in the 5th century anyway, even in Gaul. So how quickly should we expect to find monasteries in the north of Britain? Well, we certainly have those Gaulish connections, but the trouble is we just don't know what the archaeology of a 5th century Western Roman Empire monastery looks like. When you look at someone like Vindolanda with these series of apsidal buildings and a series of, we've seen some of these other hints of early Christianity, is this what a monastic site might look like? It's possible, but one of the struggles we have with Vindolanda is the problems with dating this material. Is all this stuff contemporary? Is it early 5th century? Is it late 5th century? How many of these structures are associated with each other? And also, one of the other problems with Vindolanda, there's a whole series of these round-ended buildings from northern sites in Britain, both north and south of Hadrian's Wall, including a big apsidal building from Traprain Law itself. Now, are these churches, or are these just a local northern British tradition of building structures, building secular structures? I think the jury's still out a bit on that one. So to finish off very quickly, key conclusions. There's real challenges of identifying Roman Christianity in the 4th century, but it's definitely there. we can find lots of material, Christian imagery, Christian tombstones, Christian objects. It's certainly there. There's big changes in the 5th century as the church expands to the north and the west, and clearly the church in Britain continues to have connections with the continent. This is not an isolated church. It's a church in the mainstream of late Roman, late antique Christianity. There you go. I'll finish there.